We have completed the first two stages of respiratory function, namely ventilation and external respiration. Now for transport. How is oxygen transported from the pulmonary capillary? A huge amount of oxygen, 98.5% of oxygen, is picked up by hemoglobin and travels in the form of oxyhemoglobin. The rest of the oxygen, 1.5% of oxygen, is dissolved in plasma and travels as a dissolved gas. Now for the transport of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, which originates in the body cells, travels in three different ways. 70% of carbon dioxide travels in the form of bicarbonate ions. 23% of carbon dioxide is picked up by hemoglobin and travels in the form of carbaminohemoglobin. The remaining 7% of carbon dioxide is dissolved in plasma and travels as a dissolved gas. The bicarbonate ion comes from carbon dioxide mixing with water and making carbonic acid. And carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. H2CO3 is carbonic acid, which dissociates into H plus and HCO3 minus. Let's take a look at the role of hemoglobin in transport. Hemoglobin is blue. When oxygen leaves the alveolus, it binds to hemoglobin and becomes oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin is red. This is why oxygenated blood vessels are red in color. When oxyhemoglobin reaches a body cell, it releases the oxygen, and the oxygen is now free to enter the body cell. Once it releases the oxygen, hemoglobin, which is now blue in color, can pick up carbon dioxide, which leaves the body cell. Carbon dioxide now binds to hemoglobin and forms a molecule called carbaminohemoglobin. There is yet another molecule that has a high affinity for hemoglobin. In fact, it has the highest affinity to hemoglobin than any other molecule, and that is carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is a deadly gas. It is a compound that is made up of one carbon and one oxygen. Carbon monoxide is a deadly gas because it has a very high affinity for hemoglobin. It binds to hemoglobin 200 times more tightly than oxygen. So the result is death. When carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin, no other molecule can bind to it. Oxygen cannot be picked up by hemoglobin, and so the result is death. The next stage in respiratory function is internal respiration. So for this, we'll take a look at how hemoglobin drops off the oxygen. In what circumstances does the hemoglobin drop off the oxygen? Each hemoglobin molecule can hold up to 4 oxygen molecules. However, depending upon the need of a tissue or a cell, the hemoglobin releases 1, 2, 3, or 4 oxygen molecules. This graph represents the percent oxygen saturation of hemoglobin. This means how much of the hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen. Since there are 4 oxygen molecules, if the hemoglobin is still holding on to all 4 oxygen molecules, then it is said to be 100% saturated. If it is holding on to 3 oxygen molecules, then it's said to be 75% saturated. This graph shows that the hemoglobin is 75% saturated. This is shown by the blue line that connects to the oxygen dissociation curve. So let's look at the next two rules that we need to know. And that has to do with the position of these curves. Now look at the normal here. This is the normal body temperature, and this is the blue line that you see here is the normal. That is your 75% saturation that we just talked about. If there is a curve that is to the right of the normal, so this is right of the normal, then this means that oxygen is being released. Means the hemoglobin is giving up the oxygen. If there are any lines that are to the left of the normal, this means that oxygen is being held by the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is holding on to the oxygen. This is how hemoglobin decides whether or not to give up the oxygen. So when you look at this at 43 degrees Celsius, the temperature of a tissue which is very high clearly means that the tissue is metabolically active. So the hemoglobin decides to give up the oxygen. So any curve to the right means giving up the oxygen. Any curve to the left means holding on to the oxygen. So clearly a tissue that's cold, 10 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, is much lower than body temperature. The hemoglobin decides to hold on to the oxygen and says, well, you're not doing anything. You don't need any oxygen. So the hemoglobin holds on to the oxygen. Let's interpret the oxygen dissociation curves for pH. Let's look at the normal pH first. Here we have the normal pH, and like we said earlier, anything to the right means that the oxygen is being released. So just by going with our rules, we'll say oxygen is being released or dissociated. Oxygen is dissociated. And anything to the left means oxygen is being held. Now, let's see if that makes sense from a physiological point of view. Why is it that pH 7.2 is on the right side? It's on the right side because any tissue that's active tends to have a lower pH than normal. So an active tissue will have a low pH. So pH is very low when a tissue is active. When a tissue is passive, not working very hard, is sort of an inactive tissue. When you have an inactive tissue, then the pH tends to be high.